everybody, and welcome back to my super chill 6-part series on world building. Last week we talked about mountains and valleys and rivers and oceans and air, floating islands and whatever. So this week I'm going to talk about flora and fauna, and actually I slipped inorganics in there too. Different from topography because it's not surface level. But I'll get into it in a second. So this is animal, vegetable, and mineral, essentially. So the first thing is animals, and I am including humans in here because we are animals, much as we like to think that we're not. We are. So that includes mammals, bugs, lizards, fish, birds, amphibians, all kinds of animals, and how they interact with your landscape. So each of these creatures has different needs, obviously, and those sorts of things need to be considered when you are populating your terrain. So obviously you're not going to want a reindeer in the desert without a good reason for it to be there. Most of your land animals aren't going to be in water, and we know a fish out of water is no good at all. So you have to do at least a little bit of research, either on your fantasy world or on real life terrains, to work out which animals go where and what they do. And of course, when you have an animal in a place, you have to have a way to feed that animal. So if you have, say, a leopard in an area, you're going to need to know what animals that leopard eats. And likewise, if you have like a mouse, you need to know what animals might want to eat that mouse, because the ecosystem is complex. And of course, you don't need to go, like, if you're writing a story about people and it's mostly political, you don't need to go into the little details about what cats are hunting what mice. But these are some things that you need to, if you're not going to use a real world setting, these are things that you need to consider in order to give your world that realness about it. If that makes sense. Then the other thing is imported animals. For instance, if you have a leopard but you live in a city in Europe, that leopard is most likely imported. And you wouldn't think this would matter if you have it in like a zoo or a private collection, but sometimes they get out and they have an impact on the area and the ecosystem around them. Also, they have special needs. So if you live in, say, England, but you have a leopard, there has to be a way to make that poor leopard comfortable, because it's not meant to be in England. So these are things you need to consider, how not only what effect the animal has on the world, but what effect that world has on the animal. So then the next thing I want to talk about is the different plants that you find in these areas. Now, I want to break these plants down because I don't want to go into like all the individual plants that you might have in any particular region, because there are a lot of plants out there, y'all. So I'm going to break them down into ways that they might be relevant to your story. All right. So the first one we have is edible plants. So these are fruits and vegetables, obviously, also things like salad greens and nuts and seeds. And these are plants whose function primarily is to be eaten, and therefore they're going to be valuable as agriculture, cash crops. Also, you might have characters wandering through the wilderness who happen upon an apple tree. So that's what I mean by edible plants. And of course, some grow well in some areas, some don't grow so well in other areas, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Then we have things like medicinal plants. Medicinal plants are plants that are used to heal certain illnesses or aid certain conditions. We use them to make specific effects in our body. We don't just eat them because we're hungry. We eat them to fix something that's wrong or to help something. These can be cultivated. They can be grown in gardens. They can be grown in greenhouses and then shipped elsewhere. They can be found wild. A lot of them look like other things. So you can have two plants, one that's very medicinally helpful and one that's actually poisonous, or toxic. So you need to have possibly that option. You need to know what is medicine in your world. Some plants are kept just because they're fragrant. They might be edible, they might be medicinal, they might be a lot of things, but their value is on their fragrance. This is typically flowers, but there are a lot of botanicals, which are like citrus peels or cinnamon bark, or others like some herbs are very aromatic. So that's what they have value for. And the reason I bring this one up is because if you're talking about fragrance, because scent is very strongly linked to memory, scent does have, in a later video, I'm going to talk about the importance of sensory details in your writing. And fragrance is very important sometimes. So it would help to know what plants are available in what region, which things are considered exotics, especially when you're talking about things like perfume. Some plants are just visual. A lot of times these plants are considered standards of beauty, like for instance a rose, or they're exotic, like orchids, or they're just kind of like cute and fun, like strawberry flowers and daisies. So, and also when I get into language, and at some point I'm going to do a video on the language of flowers, these tend to be symbols which are understood by the culture at large. So I'm not going to do culture quite yet, but when we get there, it's going to be important. Then we have trees. Now, trees have their own category because trees are so important. They're so important. They kind of transcend everything else, both physically and symbolically. Trees provide so much that is important to the landscape. They provide shelter to a lot of animals. They provide shade to a lot of plants that maybe don't need full sun. They provide a lot of times nutrients. Also, their roots will help with the soil quality. Some trees are sort of toxic to they're very acidic, so they're not great for the soil. Some trees are invasive. Some trees provide edible fruits, like apples. Some have seeds, like oak, that are edible but need to be processed a certain way. Trees have a whole host of uses. Also, obviously, wood is a building material. You can actually build a house in a tree, at which point it becomes sort of its own settlement. They can be their own ecosystem if they have birds and squirrels and bugs and whatever living in there. So trees, you need to know what trees live in your area, what they're used for, how they affect the area, the plants and animals around them, and what value the humans, if any, put on them. There are toxic plants, so these are kind of linked to medicine in that they can be used as actual poison, so they can be used as a murder weapon. They can also be used as a source of drama if somebody thought it was a medicinal plant but actually turned out to be a toxic plant. You have a neat little conflict there, and lots to write about. Sometimes you can use toxic plants as medicine. Things like belladonna is hugely toxic, but people with heart conditions take it because, it's good. So toxic plants are always good for a story. Then we have carnivorous plants. I just included these because I like them. So carnivorous plants are things like Venus flytraps or monkey pouches or that sort of thing, whereas they are not an animal, they are definitely a plant. But they attract, trap, and digest. Usually insects, but sometimes very small mammals. It's not unheard of. Sometimes little froggies and sometimes birds. I think I've heard of birds. So, they're very interesting. I'm not sure what obvious use you would have for them in a story, except to just be a bit of interest, but they tend to be tropical, so that's also the terrain actually is important. I live in a desert valley, and I have tried to grow both of those, and it's very difficult because they like a lot of humidity and a lot of heat, and they need also a lot of airflow. So it's like, how do you give them the humidity they need in a desert, and how do you give them airflow? Because the obvious way to give them humidity is to put a bell jar on top, right? But then they can't breathe, so this is a real world example of why this research is important. And then my last example of important plants is called ground cover. It's things like ferns, it's things like grasses, it's things that spread fast and wide. A lot of these tend to be invasive, so they can be bad for native plants if they're imported. They can also be bad if they are native because they just push everything else out. But the impact they might have on your story is that something might get lost and have to be found in the grasses, or people can use them for cover, all kinds of things. Don't underestimate the value of a simple grass. The last thing I want to talk about in this section is inorganic resources. This could possibly have been in the waterways and terrain section, but I kind of like it here because it does kind of fit. It's less dependent on water and hills than other things might be, but it's still important, and it can be very important to your story, and that is mineral deposits. And I'm talking about things like iron and clay and gold and granite and salt. Salt is super important, you guys, especially in the desert. If you don't get enough salt out here, you'll get sick. You get bad sick. So a lot of these mineral deposits can be a source of great wealth for the community that lives there. If you have a lot of gold, obviously, if you have huge gold mines or huge precious gem mines, obviously that's an obvious source of wealth. But salt mines also do quite well. Clay deposits are great because it's basically you have something that somebody else doesn't have. So someone might need stone, and you have a lot of stone. You have a wealth of stone. But because you have a lot of stone, you might not have a lot of trees. And so you've got trade already set up there. There's a community down there that's got a forest. You trade your stone for their wood, and that's a good working economic relationship. Then you have the probably lesser things. So things like salt, things like clay, they're still very, very useful. Although actually I would say salt is higher than clay. Salt is up there with gold, I think, historically. And gold is just, people just have this, I mean, it's so shiny. And the stones are just so shiny. So mineral deposits can't really be downplayed. It is a source of wealth and greatness akin to fertile farmlands and a lot of animals. It's something definitely to consider when you're creating your world. Alright, so that does it for week 2 and the flora and fauna and minerals section. I will be back next week to talk about the cosmos. So be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Bye!